The morning sun cast long shadows across the palace gardens as Catherine walked slowly along the stone path. Her footsteps echoed softly, the only sound breaking the unusual silence that had settled over the royal residence. For weeks now, whispers had filled the corridors, and worried glances were exchanged between staff members who had served the family for decades. Camilla had always been the stronger one, the one who carried herself with natural grace and authority. She possessed that special quality that made people listen when she spoke, that made them feel at ease in her presence. The crown had never seemed heavy on her head because she wore it as naturally as breathing. But lately, something had changed. Catherine noticed it first during the small family dinner last month. Camilla's hands had trembled slightly as she reached for her water glass, and there was a distant look in her eyes that hadn't been there before. When asked about the upcoming charity gala, Camilla had paused for too long, as if struggling to remember details that should have come easily to her. The doctor visits became more frequent after that. Camilla would disappear for hours, returning with forced smiles and reassurances that everything was fine. But Catherine could see through the facade. The woman who had once managed 3 royal events in a single day now struggled to focus during simple conversations. Important documents would sit on her desk for days, forgotten and unsigned. Dr. Matthews had been discreet, as royal physicians always were, but his expression told a story that words couldn't hide. Progressive memory loss, he had explained in careful, measured terms. Not immediately life-threatening, but degenerative. The kind of condition that would slowly strip away the very qualities that made Camilla the leader she had always been. The palace staff had begun to notice too. Margaret, the head housekeeper who had worked there for 30 years, mentioned how Camilla sometimes forgot the names of people she had known for decades. James, the personal secretary, spoke quietly about missed appointments and confused instructions that never would have happened before. Catherine found herself stepping in more often, handling small tasks that Camilla would normally manage herself. At first, it felt like helping a friend through a difficult time. But as weeks passed, it became clear that this wasn't temporary. The responsibilities were shifting, whether anyone was ready for it or not. The hardest part was watching Camilla's frustration with herself. During their weekly tea, Catherine would see flashes of the old Camilla, sharp and decisive, only to watch her struggle moments later to remember what they had been discussing. These glimpses made the situation even more heartbreaking. One evening, while reviewing correspondence in the study, Catherine found Camilla staring at a stack of letters with tears in her eyes. The papers were responses to royal invitations, simple matters that required basic acknowledgments, but Camilla sat frozen, unable to process what needed to be done. That night, Catherine couldn't sleep. She walked through the quiet halls, past portraits of previous generations who had faced their own challenges and transitions. The weight of what was coming began to settle on her shoulders. Someone would need to step forward. Someone would need to carry what Camilla could no longer hold. The next morning brought news of an important state visit that would require careful planning and flawless execution. Camilla accepted the responsibility with her usual grace, but Catherine could see the panic behind her eyes. As they discussed the details, it became increasingly clear that this might be the moment when everything would change. Standing in her room that evening, Catherine looked at herself in the mirror and saw someone different than she had been just months before. The quiet supporter was slowly becoming something more. The palace needed stability, the people needed confidence, and tradition demanded that someone must always be ready to serve. In the growing silence of Camilla's struggle, Catherine began to understand that her time to step forward was approaching faster than anyone had expected. The state dinner was supposed to be Camilla's moment to shine. Foreign dignitaries, carefully planned menus, and diplomatic conversations that could influence international relations. Catherine watched from across the room as Camilla greeted the ambassadors with practiced politeness, but something was wrong. During the welcome speech, Camilla paused mid-sentence. The pause stretched uncomfortably long while 200 guests waited in absolute silence. Catherine felt her heart racing as she watched the woman who had never stumbled over words suddenly search desperately for what to say next. Without thinking, Catherine moved forward. She placed a gentle hand on Camilla's arm and smoothly continued the speech where it had stopped. The guests relaxed, assuming it had been planned, but Catherine could feel Camilla trembling beside her. When the formal remarks ended, Camilla quietly excused herself, leaving Catherine to manage the evening's remaining events. For the next 3 hours, Catherine found herself in conversations with prime ministers and trade representatives. She discussed economic partnerships and cultural exchanges, topics she had only observed from the sidelines before. To her surprise, the words came naturally. Years of watching and listening had prepared her more than she realized. Ambassador Chen from the Far East seemed particularly impressed by Catherine's knowledge of their recent infrastructure projects. She had remembered details from briefings she thought she hadn't been paying attention to. The evening that could have been a diplomatic disaster instead became an unexpected success. But the real conversation happened later, in the private sitting room where Camilla waited with tears streaming down her face. She had been the picture of royal composure for so long that seeing her breakdown felt like watching an earthquake shake the strongest foundation. Camilla spoke about the terror of standing before those people and finding her mind completely blank. The names and faces that should have been familiar felt like looking at strangers. Words she had used countless times suddenly seemed foreign and impossible to access. The fear that everyone would notice, that the press would write stories, that confidence in the royal family would crumble. Catherine listened without offering empty reassurances. They both knew this wouldn't get better. Dr. Matthews had been clear about the progressive nature of the condition. There would be good days and bad days, but the overall trend was unmistakable. The question wasn't whether Camilla would need to step back, but when. Over the following weeks, they developed a quiet system. Catherine would stand closer during public events, ready to step in when needed. She began attending more briefings, learning the details of ongoing projects and commitments. Palace staff started bringing questions to Catherine when Camilla seemed overwhelmed. The transition felt strange and wrong, like wearing clothes that belonged to someone else. Catherine had never wanted this responsibility, had never asked for it. She preferred supporting roles, working behind the scenes where mistakes could be corrected privately. But want and need were different things entirely. James, the personal secretary, began scheduling private sessions with Catherine. Constitutional law, diplomatic protocol, budget management, and dozens of other subjects that seemed impossibly complex. Some evenings, Catherine would study until her eyes burned, determined to be prepared for whatever came next. The first real test came during a hospital visit to the children's ward. Camilla had always been wonderful with sick children, bringing genuine warmth and comfort to families facing impossible situations. But that day she stood frozen in the doorway, overwhelmed by the noise and confusion of the busy ward. Catherine stepped forward and began talking with the young patients and their parents. She listened to their stories, asked about their treatments, and somehow found ways to bring smiles to faces marked by worry and exhaustion. When they left 3 hours later, Camilla was quiet. That evening, Camilla made a decision that would change everything. She called for a private meeting with the senior advisors and palace officials. Catherine wasn't supposed to attend, but Camilla insisted she be there. The conversation that followed would reshape both of their lives forever. The words came slowly, carefully chosen to maintain dignity while acknowledging reality. Camilla spoke about her condition with courage that amazed everyone in the room. She outlined a gradual transition plan that would allow Catherine to assume more responsibilities, while Camilla retained her title and appeared at important ceremonial events when her health permitted. As Catherine listened to these plans being made around her, she felt the weight of a crown that hadn't yet been placed on her head. The silence that had been growing around Camilla's struggles was about to be filled with Catherine's voice, whether she felt ready or not. The announcement came on a Tuesday, morning that felt like any other day until it wasn't. Palace. Officials released a carefully worded statement about Camilla's health challenges and the gradual transfer of duties to Catherine. The words were diplomatic and respectful, but the message was clear to anyone who understood royal protocol. Catherine's phone began ringing within minutes. Reporters, distant relatives, and old friends all wanted to know how she felt about this sudden change in her life. The truth was complicated. She felt honored, terrified, unprepared, and determined all at the same time. But she gave the same calm response to everyone. She would serve to the best of her ability. The public reaction was mixed and immediate. Some praised the family's honesty about health issues and their careful planning for continuity. Others questioned whether Catherine had the experience and presence needed for such an important role. Social media filled with opinions from people who had never met either woman, but felt qualified to judge their capabilities. Margaret, the head housekeeper, found Catherine sitting in the garden that afternoon, staring at nothing in particular. The older woman sat down beside her without invitation and began talking about the previous transitions she had witnessed during her decades of service. Change was never easy, she said, but the palace had always found ways to adapt and continue serving the people. Catherine's first official solo engagement was scheduled for the following week. A ribbon-cutting ceremony for a new community center in a working-class neighborhood. Simple enough in theory, but Catherine knew that every gesture would be analyzed. Every word would be quoted, and any mistakes would be magnified by critics waiting for her to fail. She spent hours with the royal protocol officer, learning about proper procedures for such events, how to hold the scissors, where to stand for photographs, what kind of remarks were expected, and how to interact with local officials. Details that seemed trivial but could become headline news if handled incorrectly. The dress rehearsals felt absurd. Standing in an empty room, cutting imaginary ribbons while staff members pretended to be crowd members and photographers. But Catherine understood the necessity. Public appearances required precision, and there was no room for uncertainty when representing the crown. Camilla insisted on helping with the preparation, despite her obvious exhaustion. She shared stories from similar events, describing how to read a crowd's mood and adjust accordingly, how to remember names and faces during brief introductions, how to make genuine connections with people during carefully timed interactions. The night before the ceremony, Catherine couldn't sleep. She walked through the palace halls, past rooms where previous generations had faced their own moments of doubt and responsibility. The portraits seemed to watch her with expressions that might have been encouragement or judgment, depending on her mood. Morning came too quickly. The team of stylists, security personnel, and advisors descended on the palace before dawn. Every detail was planned, from the route to the community center to the backup plans if weather or protests disrupted the schedule. Catherine felt like an actor preparing for a role she had never auditioned for. During the drive to the venue, Catherine watched ordinary people going about their daily lives. Parents walking children to school, shopkeepers opening their stores, elderly couples sharing morning coffee at bus stops. These were the people she was meant to serve, and their normalcy felt both comforting and intimidating. The community center was modest but clearly important to the neighborhood. Local officials had worked for years to secure funding and support for the project. Families gathered with homemade signs and genuine excitement about the new facility that would serve their children and elderly residents. As Catherine stepped out of the car, she felt the weight of expectation from the crowd, the media, and her own conscience. Cameras flashed and recorded every moment as she approached the ribbon. The scissors felt heavier than they should have, and the simple act of cutting fabric became a symbolic moment that would define how people perceived her fitness for the role ahead. But something unexpected happened as Catherine began speaking to the assembled crowd. The prepared remarks felt natural instead of forced. Conversations with community leaders flowed easily, and genuine interest in their stories replaced nervous formality. When a young girl shyly approached with a bouquet of flowers she had picked from her grandmother's garden, Catherine's response was instinctive and warm. The event that was supposed to be a test became something more meaningful. Catherine discovered that connecting with people wasn't just about following protocol or making the right impression. It was about recognizing the importance of their hopes and struggles, and representing those concerns with dignity and genuine care. Driving back to the palace that afternoon, Catherine felt different than she had that morning. The fear was still there, along with the overwhelming sense of responsibility, but now there was also a growing confidence that she might actually be capable of doing this job well. 3 months into her new role, Catherine faced her first major crisis. A devastating flood in the northern provinces had left thousands homeless and several communities completely cut off from emergency services. The Prime Minister called at dawn, requesting immediate royal support to boost relief efforts and demonstrate national unity during the disaster. Catherine had observed Camilla handle similar emergencies before, but watching from the sidelines was vastly different from making the decisions herself. Every choice would have consequences for real people facing genuine suffering. There was no room for hesitation or uncertainty when lives were at stake. Within hours, Catherine was on a helicopter heading toward the disaster zone. Below, she could see the scope of the devastation. Entire villages were underwater, with only rooftops visible above the murky brown water. Roads had become rivers, and rescue boats moved between buildings that should have been surrounded by dry land. The local emergency coordinator met Catherine at the temporary landing site. His exhaustion was obvious after 3 days of coordinating rescues and managing overwhelming needs with inadequate resources. But his relief at seeing royal support was genuine. Federal assistance would increase dramatically now that the Crown was personally involved. Catherine spent the day moving between evacuation centers, speaking with families who had lost everything except their lives. A grandmother clutched a photo of her house that was now completely submerged. A young father described swimming through his flooded home to rescue trapped neighbors. Children drew pictures of their missing pets while their parents worried about jobs and schools that might never reopen. What struck Catherine most was how these people faced catastrophe with remarkable dignity. They shared food with strangers, comforted each other's children, and organized volunteer efforts despite their own losses. Their resilience humbled her and made clear what kind of leadership they deserved. The media coverage was extensive and mostly positive. Catherine's decision to wade through ankle-deep water to reach stranded families generated powerful images that demonstrated genuine commitment rather than ceremonial obligation. Her conversations with victims were captured, showing real empathy and active listening, rather than perfunctory sympathy. But the real work began after the cameras left. Catherine used her position to pressure government agencies for faster assistance and more comprehensive support. She called business leaders directly, encouraging private sector contributions to relief efforts. Most importantly, she ensured that royal attention didn't disappear once the immediate crisis passed. Camilla watched these efforts with pride mixed with sadness. During their private conversations, she praised Catherine's instincts and decision-making but struggled with her own growing disconnection from events she should have been leading. The disease was progressing faster than anyone had hoped, making their planned gradual transition feel inadequately slow. Dr. Matthews delivered more concerning news during his weekly visit. Camilla's lucid periods were becoming shorter and less predictable. Simple tasks that had been manageable just weeks before now required significant assistance. The time was approaching when public appearances would become impossible, regardless of how much support surrounded her. Catherine found herself making decisions that would have been unthinkable months earlier. She authorized changes to palace protocols, approved budget allocations for new charitable initiatives, and represented the royal family at international conferences. Each step felt surreal, but the positive results suggested she was handling the responsibilities better than her own doubts allowed her to believe. The flood response established Catherine's reputation as someone willing to engage directly with difficult situations rather than maintaining ceremonial distance. Approval ratings, which had been cautiously positive after her first public appearances, rose significantly following her handling of the crisis. More importantly, Catherine began to feel genuine ownership of her role rather than seeing herself as a temporary substitute. The crown wasn't something she was borrowing until someone more qualified could take over. It was becoming hers through necessity, experience, and the recognition that she could serve effectively. Late one evening, while reviewing reports from the flood recovery efforts, Catherine realized that she had stopped thinking about what Camilla would have done in various situations. Instead, she was developing her own approach to problems and opportunities. Her leadership style was emerging naturally rather than being imposed or imitated. The transition that had begun as a response to health challenges was evolving into something more significant. Catherine wasn't just filling Camilla's role temporarily. She was becoming the leader that circumstances required, shaped by her own judgment and the needs of the people she served. When Camilla announced her intention to step down completely within the next month, Catherine received the news with emotions she couldn't have predicted. Along with sadness for Camilla's deteriorating condition and anxiety about increased responsibilities, there was also a quiet confidence that she was ready for what came next. The formal ceremony was planned for a quiet Tuesday morning in the palace's private chapel. No crowds, no media circus, just a small gathering of family members and senior officials to witness the transfer of authority that had been building for months. Catherine had requested simplicity, understanding that the focus should be on dignity rather than spectacle. Camilla seemed more like herself that morning than she had in weeks. The clarity that occasionally returned during stressful moments allowed her to participate fully in conversations about the ceremony's details. She insisted on wearing the sapphire brooch that had been passed down through 5 generations of royal women, saying it belonged with whoever carried the responsibilities of service. Catherine spent the early hours walking through the palace gardens where this journey had begun. The same stone paths where she had first noticed Camilla's struggles now led her toward accepting the full weight of leadership. The transformation felt both gradual and sudden, like watching seasons change day by day until suddenly realizing that winter had become spring. The ceremony itself was brief and profound. Ancient words spoken in the chapel where countless similar moments had occurred throughout history. Catherine knelt while formal pronouncements transferred constitutional authority from one person to another. When she rose, something fundamental had changed beyond legal technicalities. Camilla placed the crown on Catherine's head with hands that trembled slightly but held steady for those crucial moments. The weight was exactly what Catherine had expected, but the sensation of responsibility was heavier than any physical object could be. Looking into Camilla's eyes, she saw relief mixed with trust that the right choice had been made. The first official act was visiting the hospital where Camilla would receive ongoing care. The facility specialized in supporting people with progressive memory conditions, providing dignity and comfort as cognitive abilities declined. Catherine wanted to ensure that Camilla's transition would be as peaceful as possible. Walking through the hospital's gardens with Camilla that afternoon, Catherine promised that she would never forget the lessons learned during these difficult months. How to listen carefully to people facing struggles, how to make decisions under pressure, and how to carry forward traditions while adapting to changing circumstances. Camilla's response surprised her. Instead of advice about leadership or warnings about upcoming challenges, she spoke about the freedom that came with letting go of burdens she could no longer carry effectively. The relief of knowing that important work would continue in capable hands, and the peace that came with accepting limitations while maintaining dignity. The public announcement was made that evening through a televised address. Catherine spoke directly to the nation about the transition, acknowledging Camilla's service and explaining her own commitment to continuing that legacy of dedicated service. The response was overwhelmingly positive, with messages of support flooding in from across the country and around the world. But the real test came in the weeks that followed. Daily decisions about policy positions, crisis responses, and resource allocation that would affect millions of people. Catherine discovered that the crown wasn't just a symbol of authority but a constant reminder of the trust placed in her judgment by circumstances and constitutional responsibility. Her first major policy initiative focused on supporting families affected by chronic health conditions, inspired directly by watching Camilla's experience. Catherine worked with medical experts and social service organizations to develop comprehensive assistance programs that addressed both patient needs and family caregiver support. The project required extensive consultation with Parliament, careful budget negotiations, and coordination between multiple government departments. Catherine found herself in complex discussions with politicians, economists, and advocacy groups defending proposals and incorporating feedback while maintaining focus on the core humanitarian objectives. Opposition leaders questioned whether someone so new to formal authority should be promoting such ambitious social programs. Catherine responded by inviting critics to meet directly with families facing similar challenges to Camilla's. The personal stories proved more persuasive than any political arguments could have been. 6 months after the formal ceremony, Catherine received a letter from a woman whose husband was battling early-onset dementia. The new support programs had enabled their family to maintain stability and dignity during an impossibly difficult time. The woman wrote that seeing Catherine's compassionate leadership gave her hope that society truly cared about people facing these challenges. Reading that letter in her private study, Catherine understood that the crown she had lifted in silence was never really about her own capabilities or ambitions. It was about being worthy of the trust placed in her by people like this woman, who needed someone in authority to understand their struggles and fight for their welfare. The transformation from supporting player to central leader was complete, but Catherine realized it had never been about replacing Camilla. Instead, she had become herself more fully, shaped by challenges that revealed strengths she hadn't known she possessed and purposes she hadn't expected to serve. 2 years later, Catherine stood once again in the palace gardens where this unexpected journey had begun. The same stone paths that had witnessed her first worried observations about Camilla's condition now surrounded her as she prepared for the most significant speech of her reign. The International Climate Summit was beginning the next day, with world leaders gathering to address environmental challenges that threatened every nation. Catherine would deliver the opening address, setting the tone for negotiations that could determine humanity's response to planetary crisis. The responsibility felt enormous but no longer overwhelming. Camilla's condition had progressed as Dr. Matthews had predicted, but the specialized care facility had become a peaceful place where she could live with dignity. Despite her declining memory, Catherine visited every week, sometimes finding Camilla alert and conversational, other times sitting quietly together in comfortable silence. During lucid moments, Camilla expressed wonder at Catherine's transformation. The uncertain woman who had once hesitated to step forward during public events had become a confident leader whose opinions were sought by presidents and prime ministers. The crown that had seemed too heavy for anyone to carry now rested naturally on someone who had grown into its requirements. The health support programs that Catherine championed had expanded into comprehensive assistance for families facing various chronic conditions, partnerships with medical institutions, research funding for treatment development, and practical support services that addressed real-world needs rather than just providing symbolic gestures. Catherine's approach to leadership had evolved into something distinctly her own. Where Camilla had been gracious and diplomatic, Catherine brought directness and urgency to issues that demanded immediate action. Where tradition called for ceremonial distance, Catherine chose authentic engagement with people facing genuine struggles. The climate summit represented everything Catherine had learned about using royal influence effectively. Instead of delivering pleasant but meaningless remarks, she planned to challenge world leaders directly about their failure to match rhetoric with adequate action. The speech would be diplomatic but unmistakably demanding. Her advisors worried about potential backlash from political leaders who preferred royal families to remain neutral on controversial issues. Catherine understood their concerns but believed that climate change transcended normal political boundaries. Future generations would judge leaders by their willingness to act decisively when action was still possible. The morning of her speech, Catherine received an unexpected gift. A lucid phone call from Camilla, whose voice carried warmth and clarity that had become increasingly rare. She wanted Catherine to know how proud she was of the leader Catherine had become, and how confident she felt about the royal family's future under Catherine's guidance. Standing before delegates from nearly every nation, Catherine delivered remarks that combined scientific urgency with moral clarity. She challenged wealthy countries to provide adequate support for vulnerable nations, demanded concrete timelines for emissions reductions, and pledged royal estates as testing sites for innovative environmental technologies. The response was immediate and polarized. Environmental advocates praised Catherine's courage in speaking truth to power, while some political commentators criticized her departure from traditional royal neutrality. But the speech accomplished its intended purpose, forcing substantive discussions about issues that had been avoided through diplomatic politeness. 3 days of intense negotiations followed, with Catherine playing an active behind-the-scenes role in encouraging compromises and maintaining momentum when talks threatened to stall. Her direct conversations with reluctant leaders helped bridge gaps between competing interests. The final agreement exceeded most expectations, establishing binding commitments and accountability mechanisms that previous summits had failed to achieve. Catherine's willingness to use royal influence assertively had contributed to breakthrough moments when traditional diplomacy reached its limits. Flying back to the palace after the summit's conclusion, Catherine reflected on how far she had traveled from the uncertain woman who had once worried about her ability to handle simple ceremonial duties. The crown that Camilla could no longer hold had become the foundation for leadership that neither of them could have predicted. That evening, in the quiet of her private study, Catherine wrote in the journal she had maintained throughout this transformation. She described the strange journey from observer to participant to leader, and her growing understanding that true authority came from serving others, rather than exercising power over them. The silence that had surrounded Camilla's struggles had been filled, not just with Catherine's voice, but with the voices of people whose needs had been ignored or misunderstood. The crown she lifted was heavy with their hopes and expectations, but that weight had become a source of strength rather than burden. Looking toward the future, Catherine saw challenges that would test everything she had learned about leadership and service. But she also saw opportunities to use royal influence in ways that could make genuine differences in people's lives. The crown was no longer something she wore reluctantly out of duty. It had become the tool through which she could accomplish the work she was meant to do.